Welcome to your Spotlight on Now. Now, as Rockers was saying, school is going to be reopening on April 19th. And of course, as school opens in about 2 weeks, we're going to be discussing the possible anxiety and stress that some of these students may face as they go back to physical school. So joining me online, I have Dr. J.P. Collier, of course, who's the president of the Psychology Association. Dr. Collier, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us on Now.
Good morning. One small correction. It's Mr. Collier, not
So no,
doctor.
so no doctor. Great. All right. So, Mr. Collier, first question, it might be a simple question, but is it really normal for children to have stress or, to feel anxious as they're going back out to school?
I think that's typical in general, but there's added anxiety, of course, given the circumstances, for a number of reasons. Part of it has to do with the concerns about safety with COVID, particularly for children who have extended family members and others who might be vulnerable, might have conditions that make them more vulnerable to COVID. So there's a concern about bringing home COVID, about being infected themselves, but also about infecting others around them. But in addition to that, because our children have been out of school for the past 2 years, a lot of them have become disconnected from their social groups and connections. And a lot of them are anxious about how they're going to interact with other people because they haven't been doing it. There's a certain element of that with adults as well who are returning to work. But it's amplified, I would say, for children.
Right. And Mr. Collier, what can that stress or anxiety look like? I know you mentioned they might be withdrawn, but what are some of the other things that parents can look out for?
Children may become somewhat sort of moody. They may have unusual patterns with sleeping and eating. They can also be irritable, and so they might, quarrel or get angry about things that seem relatively insignificant. Um, Anxiety can also be manifested as physical symptoms, headaches, stomach aches that don't seem to be connected to any medical ailment, for example, aches and pains. There are a number of different ways that anxiety can manifest.
Is the anxiety going to look different, for example, for someone who was accustomed to school and is returning versus someone, of course, who is entering the physical classroom for the first time?
That's a good question, and it's unclear. There's a particular set of challenges with children who have never been to school up until this point, and one of the reasons that there is a need for a return is that the lack of socialization, especially at the younger ages, can produce a lot of challenges for children's social development. And so I am not sure what is going to look like with the children who are entering school for the first time delayed at this point. There's a good chance that they're going to have a fair amount of difficulty coping with the setting of being in a place where there are a lot of other children because it's been completely unfamiliar to them.
Right. Now, as they are going back out to school, Mr. Collier, do we expect to see some behavioral problems? So, for example, they may have been away from social interaction for a while. So, can we see some of them acting out or lashing out in the classroom?
That's possible. Um, it's also quite likely that a lot of children are going to be really happy to reconnect. Uh, there are quite a few children who not only socially want to get back to school, but also find that the learning environment in the school setting is to their advantage. They don't like the online learning environment. It doesn't work for them. And so there's going to be a mix of responses in that regard. But anxiety can play out in the form of acting out in school, as is typically the case. Um, I, I I think that it remains to be seen how that will, how fully that will manifest, particularly with students who are faced with high pressure examinations.
Now, in terms of parents who, see these signs of anxiousness in their children, how can they, help them cope with this transition?
That is a bigger challenge. One of the things I think is to talk about or plan for what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. The more of a sense of order and control that people have over their circumstances, the better. And there are lots of things that we don't have control over. And if you're going to school, there are quite a few things that are not under your control, including the level of exposure that you have to COVID, what's going to happen in the classroom, who's teaching, what is being taught at what pace, etc. There's a lot of things that are not under our control. And so there's typically a fair amount of anxiety that is generated in the school setting. And so planning and preparation for the return to school so that the child has a clear idea of what they're going to do and how they're going to do it, the part that they have control over. The more certain they are of that, the better. It's also fundamentally good to ensure that children are getting adequate sleep, that they're going to bed at a consistent time, that they're getting up at a consistent time, that they have an adequate window to get sleep, that they are getting proper nutrition and exercise. As fundamental as those things are, they contribute to the absence of them contributes to anxiety, and ensuring that those things are consistently provided reduces the risk of it.
Right. Mr. Collier, I was reading as well that some children may have some separation issues. Of course, they've been with their parents for close to 2 years now, and they may, find it difficult to make that transition. For the children who have those issues, I mean, what can the parents do to prepare them for this?
That I'm not sure that they can prevent. What they can do, again, is sort of planning and preparation. They might even, if possible, and this assumes that parents have adequate time, space, opportunity to do so. They can, in fact, have sort of practice runs. The more that children get time away from their parents doing other things. So, for example, if families are part of social groups, church, for example, it in its own way can be an opportunity to allow children the experience of being separated from their parents for a period. When they go to different, Sunday school or whatever the case may be, those can be used as opportunities to have practice runs, if you will, with separation. This is much more likely with younger children than it is with the older ones, but it can't be completely avoided.
Right. And now, for the children who will need to, sit those exams coming up at the end of the term, do you see them being ready for something as important as that?
That's a good question. And again, it varies. I think that there have been very mixed experiences for students in online environments. And so I would say that there's some children who are going to readjust fairly quickly to the in-class environment and be able to make the adjustments, catch up as much as they need to and as much as they can. But there are others who are going to have a harder time, and it's going to be difficult for them to make the transition, and we're likely to have poorer results. That's not really surprising. We've already seen from exams that we've had over the past 2 years a certain amount of loss of learning and results that reflect lower retention and ability to make use of the material that is being taught in the online environment. And so there's going to be, I would say, a little bit of a gap. There's going to be a little bit of time necessary to make up.
Right. And Mr. Collier, for some of the teachers who might be looking at us right now, what can they do to welcome those students back to the classroom to ensure that, they kind of understand what they're supposed to do and, of course, just maintain that level in the classroom?
So teachers are going to have an interesting challenge. They always do. But I think that there's going to be a need to be more vigilant than usual to children's acting out behavior, disruptive behavior, difficulty maintaining attention, and so on. And there's going to be a need for, I think, patience and the deliberate pursuit of clarity as to what's happening with each child. That can be really challenging when you have a really big classroom. You have, 30, 40 children in your class. It's very difficult to give a lot of individual attention to each child. One of the things that I would actually recommend is a deliberate sort of intermediate introductory kind of period. So the beginning of the first class, to spend more time socially connecting and checking in with children and finding out how they're doing and how they're feeling and what's going on and what kinds of things that they are thinking about or concerned about and so on, which is not typically what teachers might be expected to do, but it may be more necessary now. It may also be useful for teachers to be aware or to rethink their framing of children's conduct issues. So children's misconduct in the classroom can be framed as disobedience or disrespect. It can be framed through that lens, but it can also be framed as an indication of something that is going on with that child. And there are already teachers who are pretty good about focusing on that and giving that consideration. But it may need to be more universally practiced to view behavior in the classroom that is disruptive or problematic in some way through the lens of it being an indication that there may be something going on and that there's a need to find out more, rather than to automatically take a sort of punitive approach.
Mr. Collier, thank you so much for joining us on Now. I mean, I think the information was helpful, not just for students, but for parents and teachers as well. And I hope that, everybody will understand the importance of having children returning to school and, of course, how to manage this anxiousness and stress that they might have ahead of the reopening. So thanks so much for joining us on Now.
Thank you.
Have a good one. And that was Mr. Charles J.P. Collier. Of course, he's the president of the Psychology Association, just giving us some tips on managing stress and anxiety that some of these students might face when school reopens on April 19th. You're on the Now Morning Show. We're going to take a break and we'll be right back. Stay with us.